Hello guys, and welcome back to Joe's Ventures, and today we're doing part 114, so that's obviously a lot of parts, of our Planet Zoo mod spotlights. We take a look at some of the wonderful mods people have been making and use them to talk about some of the wonderful biodiversity that we share our world with. So today we've got a lot of new animals, which I'm really excited to go over. Really cool. So we're going to get started off with a very interesting animal we've got. The chambered Nautilus, done by Leaf and Buffsuit. Now they made a triumphant return back to Planet Zoo modding. So let's have a look at these wonderful Nautiloids. So this is the chambered Nautilus, also known as the pearly Nautilus. So they are the best known species of Nautilus. And you can see that shell, really interesting shell, and it's got that counter shading as well, and it's very much a spiral as well. So the counter shading is there to help hide themselves from predators. So like when something's on top, they can see, oh, it's actually the darkness of the ocean. A lot of animals have counter shading even on land. So these guys are typically found much throughout the South Pacific. They can be found from near reefs on the seafloor, from like Australia, Japan, and Micronesia. And very interesting. They're very different from, of course, most other cephalopods that we know today. So these guys, like most Nautilus species, are more basal to what other more like earlier cephalopods would have been like. And they do not have a lens, and that is comparable to a pinhole camera, which is quite interesting. They also have 90 cirri, or if you say that, as C-I-R-R-I. They're often referred to as tentacles, but they're like lots of little tentacles. They do not have sunkers, and actually differ significantly from like the limbs of other like later ones like cuttlefish and squid and things like that, which is quite interesting. And also, like all members of their genus, they have rhinopores, which are located near the eye that allow them to smell and detect chemicals in their food. And the earliest fossils of these guys, we actually have these, we know that these came from the early Pleistocene, and they lived in the Philippines in Luzon, which is quite interesting. And what's also quite interesting as well, they were once thought to be living fossils. Now the chambered Nautilus is actually considered very different from ammonites. And the recent fossil record shows that there's actually more diversity among Nautilus now than have been found since the extinction of the dinosaurs. So they've kind of done a little bit better now, or there's more diverse now, which is quite interesting. And indeed, the taxon of a chambered Nautilus has actually been grouping of tens of different species of Nautilus under one name. So very likely they'll be split in the future. But in terms of their life cycle, these guys, as I mentioned, live in the ocean. It's very hard to study their life cycle because of that. Let's see if we can find one in the water. Is there one in the water? Must be. They all must be coming onto land. Well, I'll have a look at you since you look like you're swimming away. But anyway, although Nautilus is hard to study in the wild, all the information we have on their life cycle is based on captive animals. And their eggs have actually never been seen in the wild. And they've been kept in public aquariums since the 1950s, but they were first bred in captivity in the Waikiki Aquarium in 1995, with a couple of other Nautilus species being bred earlier. And a captive breeding program actually is quite rare to breed them. And unlike most cephalopods, these guys actually lack a larval stage. So these eggs are kind of laid in crevices or between corals by the female, and the Nautilus shell of the young kind of develops while they're in the egg, and the breach the top of the egg when the Nautilus fully emerges. And depending on water temperature, these eggs will hatch between 9 to 15 months. In 2017, they were bred in the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which managed to, possibly for the first time ever, to film young emerging from their eggs, which is quite cool. And like other nautiloids, but unlike other cephalopods, chambered Nautilus are actually quite long-lived. So most cephalopods live for like a year. Even giant squids only live for like a year and a half. Guys can live, are only reach maturity within 5 years, so they do live quite a bit longer. In terms of their diet, these guys typically feed on underwater carrion and debris, as well as living shellfish and crayfish and things like that, and crabs as well, which is quite cool. And they're mainly scavengers though. Chambered Nautilus have been described to eat pretty much anything that smells, and their food is stored in a stomach-like organ that's known as a crop, kind of similar to bird crops, but obviously very different, where they can store food for a great amount of time without it denaturing. And in terms of their cell geometry, you can see they often is used an example of a golden spiral, and while that's kind of wrong ratio, it's kind of use often as an example of that. But the shell of the Nautilus functions very similar to how a lot of ancient ammonites did. So a lot of these have little chambers inside them, and that allows them to control their buoyancy. They can take water in and then pump gas in and pump water out to control their buoyancy. And so they'll flood a chamber and then put gas in that chamber so they can dive up and down. That's how they control their buoyancy. And they're actually only capable of staying up to depths of about 2,000 feet before they implode, which is due to the pressure. But these guys often inhabit different segments of their shell as it grows. As they grow new, larger cells, they move their internal organs into the next biggest one up until maturity. And all the smaller chambers, once inhabited, are used to regulate their depth, which is quite cool. So yeah, very interesting little bit of information about the ammonites. Not ammonites, Nautilus. I like nautiloids very much. Very, very cool little animals. Nice to see them in Planet Zoo. Definitely a great animal to return with for Buff Zoo, because Buff Zoo's off been doing lots of Planet Zoo modding. And I'm not Planet Zoo, Zoo Tycoon 2 modding. So it's nice to see Buff Zoo's back and giving us a really, really cool animal, the Nautilus. I love Nautilus. Very, very cool. So next up, by Leaf, Jen, and TNT, we have got the black-headed monitor. So very much a couple cuties here. Very, very cool. So the black-headed monitor, or the black-tailed monitor, these guys are a relatively small species of monitor lizard from Australia, and they're often also called the mournful monitor or the freckled monitor, even sometimes the racehorse monitor, which is sometimes shared with the gold's monitor, so it's really hard to call them that, but really, really cool. So in terms of distribution, they're kind of considered the most most widespread or widely distributed species of monitor across Australia, and they can be found throughout the mainland and even the northern islands, such as Magnetic Island. They're only absent in the southernmost areas of Australia because probably it's cold, and there's a couple different subspecies. There's Ornamentus that can be found in eastern Australia, and the main species, Tortoise, is found mainly on West Australia, and the two subspecies will live together in some areas such as the east coast of Queensland. And these guys are typically arboreal, so these guys will spend most of the time up in trees, and they're usually found in forests, shrublands, woodlands, but also will inhabit deserts. And they take shelter in like tight spaces such as rocky crevices or tree hollows or loose bark, which is quite cool. So in terms of their size, they can get up to about 80 centimeters long, so quite big. And they're, obviously I mentioned, they're two different subspecies. The populations around Perth are completely black, but populations further north can be lighter in color. And up to 60 centimeters, the freckled monitor, which is the other subspecies. They're a smaller subspecies with more lighter coloration and less of a spiky tail. So we'll talk about the hatchlings while we get a chance, because these are all cuties. So hatchlings, actually, of both subspecies, they're quite brightly coloured, but only freckled monitors maintain much of that coloration into their adulthood. And males can be identified after sexual maturity, which is usually about 2 years of age, by a large cluster of spiky scales around the animal's vent, so that's kind of around the cloaca. And female specimens lack these protrusions and really possess a small number of spines, only slightly larger than the surrounding scales. But both will reach sexual maturity by the time they reach about 20%, not 20%, 20 centimeters long from snout to vent, so that's from the tip of their snout till their cloaca, doesn't include their tail. So in terms of behavior, these guys are typically more active during the spring. Let's see, let's find that out. More active during the spring, and they may travel a kilometer every day in search of food to accumulate enough like fat resources to last them through the 6 or 7 months, winter months, where they are inactive. So although they're both semi-arboreal, these guys, the dominant subspecies is slightly less arboreal than the freckled monitor, and they actually will sometimes kill their tails over their heads and body while basking, but the reason for this behavior we don't really know. So in terms of these guys' diet, these guys will feed on small mammals, other lizards such as agamids and skinks and geckos, and smaller monitor species. They've even been known to eat and capture thorny devils. Those are the really cool ones that eat ants in Australia, and they're really, really spiky. So it's really, really interesting. They'll also invade birds' nests to eat eggs and chicks. They'll also eat a variety of insects such as ornithopterans, which is kind of like moths and butterflies, beetles, ants, and stick insects. There's even been conflicting reports of whether diet is consistently mammals and small vertebrates or small insects and things like that. But it's possible that there's a lot of variation in their diet. They're kind of just like on that seafood diet like most monitors are. They eat what they can find. And in terms of reproduction, these guys, the breeding season is about in November, at which point these guys will start sharing the same tree. Females typically lay a clutch of about 6 to 11, but they may lay up to 17 eggs around December, and then they'll hatch around February or March, and incubating at a temperature between 27 and 29 degrees Celsius. So, yeah, really, really interesting animal. Do love these little guys. So, again, this was done by Leaf, Jen, and TNT. Really awesome to get some more monitor lizards. We do love seeing reptiles. And we've got another reptile coming up. Very, very interesting reptile. So this next one was done by Leaf and Jen. We have got the Radiated Tortoise, which I'm quite excited to talk about. So the Radiated Tortoise, these guys are a species of tortoise native to the and most abundant in the southern parts of Madagascar. They can also be found on the rest of the islands, and they've been introduced to islands like Reunion and Mauritius, which is quite interesting. And these guys can typically grow up to about 16-inch carapace, or about 41 centimeters, and weigh up to about 16 kilograms, or about 35 pounds. They're often actually considered one of the most beautiful tortoises in the world, so we'll get into why that's a very sad thing. We'll get onto that. So these guys don't differ too much in terms of their shape from other tortoises, or they have the same basic tortoise plan. They have their high carapace, elephant-like feet, things like that. And you can see the carapace there is quite beautifully marked with these yellow lines that radiate from the center. And that's where they get the name the Radiated Tortoise, because they have the spots and then the kind of lines radiating out on their kind of scoots and things like that, which is quite cool. The star pattern kind of where they get their name. And the Radiated Tortoise is quite a bit larger than the Indian star tortoise, and there's a little bit differences. And there is slight sexual dimorphism. Compared to females, males usually will have longer tails, and the notches between their tails will become more noticeable. So that's how you kind of tell male and female tortoises apart. And in terms of its lifespan, like most other tortoises, they're very long-lived, with the oldest tortoise ever recorded, or the oldest Radiated Tortoise, died at about 188 years old, so very, very long-lived. So in terms of their range and distribution, these guys are typically only found in the extreme southern and southwestern parts of Madagascar. And as I mentioned, they have been introduced into Reunion, and they prefer brush, thorn forests, and woodlands of southern Madagascar. These guys are herbivores, and they are grazing. So they about 80 to 90% of their diet is from grasses and grazing. But they will eat succulent plants and fruit, and they like to eat cactuses. They're often known to graze regularly in the same area, and they keep the vegetation quite closely trimmed. And they seem to prefer new growth than mature growth because it has high protein and low fiber. So in terms of its reproduction, these guys, males, when they get about 31 centimeters, or about 12 inches in length, these guys, females need to be a little bit bigger than that, but they'll start breeding. The male becomes fairly noisy and starts bobbing his head, and then in some cases they may lift the female up to the front edge of his shell to keep her moving away. The male will mount the female, of course, and then do that. And once these impregnated the female, she'll lay eggs. They can lay up to about 3 to 12 eggs, and they will make a hole, excavate a hole about 6 to 8 inches, or about 15 to 20 centimeters deep, and then depart. So incubation is actually quite long for this species. They usually last between 5 to 8 months, and juveniles are typically 1.2 to 1.6 inches, or about 3 to 4 centimeters long upon hatching. And usually the yellow coloration of the adults, unlike that, they're often an off shade of white, which is quite interesting. And then the juveniles will often have that high dome look that you see of most radiated tortoises, kind of not soon after hatching, which is quite interesting. And actually, in March of 2023, the Mr. Pickles, which was a 90-year-old radiated tortoise, and Mrs. Pickles, who was 53, they welcomed 3 tortoise hatchlings. And it was the first time being a dad for this endangered tortoise, and the species actually quite rarely produces offspring activity. And most fortunately, a zookeeper noticed her lay her eggs, and then they relocated to the reptile amphibian house where the parameters were quite perfect for these guys to grow up in. And the eggs were monitored, and zookeepers were able to mimic what would happen in nature in order for them to hatch. So really, really cool. But very, very sadly, this is a species that is critically endangered. And why is it critically endangered? It's because of habitat loss, being poached for food, and overexploited for the pet trade, as we'll get into. So there's no estimates of the wild population available, but the numbers are believed to be declining, and it actually is very possible these guys could be extinct in the wild very soon. In the North American studbook, there's about 300 species in the captive breeding program around North America. And in 2005, there were closed. The Wildlife Survival Centre closed, and they were often moved and things like that. And actually, in March 2013, there was smugglers were arrested for carrying 21 radiated tortoises and 24 Angkor tortoises through in Thailand, which sucks. And there's been lots of confiscations because these guys can go for quite a bit of money. And yeah, people have been trying to breed them in captivity, and there's like big smuggling efforts of like hundreds of tortoises trying to bring them into countries because they're quite a common pet, and I don't believe they breed in captivity too well. So the pet trade has been a very big issue for these guys, especially living in Madagascar. And also habitat loss, of course. Lots of habitat destruction going on in Madagascar, things like that. But yeah, really, really cool species, and I hope they're doing better in the future because they're just so cool. I love these guys. So these guys were done by Leaf and Jen, did a really wonderful job. So next up, we are going to have a look at a remake. This is by Ginger Toast and Thomas. We have got the White Stork. So really, really cool animal. So the White Stork, these guys are a large bird from the stork family, and you can see their plumage is mainly white with like black on the bird's wings, and you can see adults often have long red legs and these red pointed beaks, and they measure on average about 100 to 115 centimeters, about 39 to 45 inches from beak tip to the end of the tail, and they have a wingspan of between 155 and 215 centimeters, or 61 to 85 inches in wingspan. And there's two subspecies, which slightly different size. One breeds in Europe, north of Finland, northwestern Africa, southwestern Asia, and southern Africa. So that's where they breed. And the white stork is actually a long-distance migrant, so they often will fly down into Africa, so like sub-Saharan Africa, as far as South Africa, so it's quite a big flight. That's where they go in the winter, and even in India, they'll hang around there. And then when migrating between Europe and Africa, they'll avoid crossing the Mediterranean Sea, and they use detours like the Strait of Gibraltar and Levant for things like that, and use the air thermals to kind of fly over them. So that's quite interesting. So there's two subspecies, as we mentioned. There's the dominant subspecies, which is found in northwestern Africa, and then they will kind of nest in northern Africa and Europe. And there's another one that kind of lives in Turkmenistan and travels from Iran to India, so not quite a huge migration. So in terms of the distribution habitat, as I mentioned, the dominant subspecies typically lives in breeds in Europe and then comes down and winters in Africa, while the other one kind of lives in Iran, breeds in Iran, comes down to India, which is quite interesting. So in terms of their behavior, these guys are a gregarious bird, so they like to live together with lots of other birds, and there's been flocks of up to thousands of individuals found. But non-breeding groups typically are about 40 to 50 birds during the breeding season, which is quite interesting. Breeding pairs may gather in small groups to hunt as well, so that's quite interesting. In terms of communication, these guys also will use lots of bill chattering and things like that to communicate, which often sounds like machine gun fire. And the birds will make these sounds by rapidly opening and closing their beak, and also can amplify their calls with a throat sac or pouch, which acts as like a resonator, and they'll have alarm calls that they use and hissing and things like that for threats and displays, and to be like, hey, there's a predator out here, things like that. So in terms of their breeding, these guys typically like to breed in open farmlands. Have a look at the cute little baby while we talk about their breeding. So these guys typically like to breed in open farmlands with access to wetlands and building a large stick nest in the trees, or on buildings, and even on man-made platforms. Each nest is typically about 1 to 2 meters, or about 3 feet or 6 feet wide, and typically 0.8 to 1.5 meters in diameter, or about 2 feet to 5 feet, and can weigh between 60 to 250 kilograms, or about 130 to 550 pounds in weight. And these nests are typically built in loose colonies, and they're not persecuted, as it's actually a good omen, so they often will nest close to human habitation, and they can be seen nesting on churches and buildings. And people like them because they're a good omen. It means like summer's coming, like it's a good thing, which is quite cool. And several birds will often nest within these stork nests. That includes like sparrows, starlings, owls, wagtails, which is quite interesting. I think that's quite cool. And these paired birds will greet by engaging in up and down crouch displays, which is quite interesting. And high frequency pair copulation has often been seen with spoon competition, things like that. So in terms of their breeding, these guys raise a single brood every year. They typically will lay 4 eggs, though ranging from 1 to 7. been recorded, and their eggs are typically white, but they often look dirty or yellowish due to a color coating that they have. They typically are between 3 to 2 inches and weigh about 96 to 129 grams, or about 3 to 4 ounces, which is quite interesting. And incubation begins as soon as the first egg is laid, so the brood hatches pretty much asynchronously, and they begin to hatch 30 to 34 days later. The first hatchling has a competitive edge over the others, and while the stronger chicks are not aggressive towards weaker siblings, they can kind of outcompete other siblings, and even the parents will kill them. This behavior will occur when there's food shortages to reduce the brood size, to increase the survival of the nestlings, for example. And white stork nestlings do not often attack each other, and the parents' feeding method will kind of mean stronger siblings cannot outcompete ones directly. Hence, obviously, the parent kind of has to kill them. And the temperature and weather around the time of hatching is quite important. So cool temperatures and wet weather actually increases the chick mortality quite a bit. And somewhat unexpectedly, they found that later hatchling chicks, which succeeded reaching adulthood, actually produce more chicks than their early hatchling nestmates, which is quite interesting. The body weight for these chicks actually increases quite rapidly for the first few weeks, and then reaches a plateau of about 4 kilos, 3.4 kilos, or 7.5 pounds at 45 days. And the length of the beat also increases linearly those first 50 days. And young birds typically feed on insects and the earthworms, which are regurgitated from the parents onto the floor of the nest. And then older chicks are able to pretty much reach into the mouths of their parents to obtain food. And they typically will fledge at about 58 to 64 days after hatching. And then they generally will begin breeding once they reach about 4 years old, even though the age of first breeding has been recorded as early as 2 years and as late as 7 years. And the oldest known wild stork is about 39 years old and has been ringed in Switzerland, while captive birds have been known to live well past 35 years, which is quite interesting. So in terms of feeding, let's have a look at the adults. They'll feed on all sorts of animal prey. So they prefer to forage in meadows, which are roughly about 5 kilometers of their nest, and sites vegetation where they're shorter and more available. And the diets will vary a lot during the season. They'll feed a lot on insects like grasshoppers, beetles, locusts, crickets, earthworms. They'll eat small reptiles such as the edible frog and common frogs. They'll even eat small mammals such as voles, moles, and shrews. And less commonly, they'll feed on bird eggs and young birds, fishes, mollusks, crustaceans, and scorpions. Though they typically hunt mainly during the day, they'll swallow small prey whole, but they'll kill and break apart larger prey before swallowing. And rubber bands have been mistaken for earthworms that even caused blockages in their digestive tract. So, and there's even been reports of white storks eating like rabbits and things like that, which is quite interesting. So, in terms of their conservation, there had been a decline. There's been a decline due to industrialization and changes in agriculture, which has included a lot of draining of wetlands and things like that, between the beginning in the 19th century, with the last wild individual in Belgium being seen in 1895, in Sweden in 1995, and in Switzerland 1950, and in the Netherlands 1991. However, they have been reintroduced to a lot of regions, so even though the decline, there's been a lot of conservation going into these guys, so they've actually been introduced to many different areas, and they're considered least concern since 1994, which is quite interesting, after being evaluated as near threatened in 1988. So that's quite interesting. And they're often covered a lot by treaties and things like that. And threats to these guys include things like continuous loss of habitat due to human activities, collisions with power lines, use of DDT and other pesticides that weakens the egg shells, and which has been used to like combat locusts in Africa, and illegal hunting on their migration routes and wintering grounds. So there is quite a few large populations. There's about 52,000 pairs in Poland, 30,000 pairs in Ukraine, 20,000 pairs in Belarus. Lithuania has 13,000 pairs, and basically a lot of other countries will have less than 10,000 pairs. So quite interesting. The one with like the least amount, there's been some reintroductions in Denmark. They've consistently bred there since the 15th century, and then they declined a lot, but they're breeding at a lot of places. And they're breeding a lot in Estonia, things like that. And even in August 2019, there were some released in the Kemp estate in Western Sussex, and they have been breeding there. Even since 2020, there have been 5 baby storks born in the UK, so that's a really great conservation, you know. We love our rewilding and things like that. And these guys, in terms of cultural impact, these guys have been considered often like a good omen, like people like them. Because they are large and they eat vermin, so they'll eat rats and mice and things. and they nest quite close to humans, so people kind of see them as a good omen, because when they come back from Africa, that means that the spring's coming, so they're considered a good omen. And a lot of other cultures, they're not too fair of humans, so they're basically a lot of cultures like them, and they often began with the story of European folklore. The storks will come and deliver babies to people and things like that, so very, very interesting to see how these guys have impacted human culture. But yeah, really, really cool species. I think Ginger Toast did a wonderful job with these storks. Really, really awesome animal. Love storks. So, next up, we have got another cool species. Ginger Toast and Thomas did a great job with the white stork, but now we've got the Brazilian porcupine done by Leaf and Jen. A really, really awesome mod I'm excited to talk about. So, this is the Brazilian porcupine. So these guys are a porcupine found in Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, Guyana, French Guiana, Peru, Paraguay, Suriname, Bolivia, and Trinidad, with one record from Ecuador, which is quite interesting. And these guys will typically live in tropical forests at elevations up to about 1,500 meters. So you can see these guys are covered in short, thick spikes that are whitish to yellowish in color, and it's mixed with these darker hairs, with the underside being quite grayish, and you can see their lips and nose are quite fleshy as well. They also, like most New World porcupines, very different from Old World porcupines. New World porcupines often have a prehensile tail, which they often will have a curly tip that allows them to grip tree branches, because New World porcupines very much are climbers. They like hanging out in the trees. These guys can typically grow to about 40 inches long, or about a meter long, but half of that is tail, so about a meter or so is their length, and they can weigh about 9 pounds, or about 41 kilograms, and there's typically no spines found on the tail, which is actually quite long. It's about 13 to 19 inches, and its feet are also quite reflective of an arboreal lifestyle, because these guys will often use their hands to grip branches, with four long-clawed toes on there, as you can see there. So let's see them climbing. Is the other one climbing? Let's see if we can find one climbing. Oh, where is it? Oh, you probably start climbing anyway. But anyway, let's carry on. In terms of their behavior, these guys are quite shy and nocturnal, and they're typically either solitary or live in pairs on the branches of trees. So, and they often during the day they'll rest in like a well-shaded area or a hollow of a tree, and they'll often hang out like 6 to 10 meters above the ground. And they rarely descend to the ground, but they show little fear if they happen to be caught. They're not actually quite aggressive, but they will defend themselves ferociously if they are attacked. And in terms of their diet, these guys will typically eat things such as like leaves and fruits and small fresh twigs and shoots and roots and flowers and pretty much anything like that. They'll even eat buds and agricultural crops such as corns and bananas. So they're quite like that. And they can be easily tamed and kept in captivity. So these guys can be kept in zoos, things like that. You probably often see them in zoos. Intra-Pacific interactions will often consist of biting or often attempting to kind of injure each other. Oh, there's the baby. I was looking for the baby. Have a look at the baby. We'll have a look later, which is quite interesting. And when excited, these guys will actually stamp their hind feet, which is also quite cool. And in terms of their vocalizations, these guys will kind of growl and cry. And if caught, these guys will roll into a ball, and they also use their prehensile tail to curl around branches when they climb, so which is quite interesting. And in terms of reproduction, typically females will give birth to a single baby in the spring. And when this little baby's a newborn, the newborn will be covered in red hairs and small spikes. And this is probably not to hurt the mother's insides as she gives birth. But once they are born, their spikes will harden quite quickly. And so they basically will be protected, which is quite interesting. And another thing as well is these guys are considered least concern. As I mentioned, they have such a wide range. So they can be found pretty much most around tropical South America, so quite a wide range, and they're considered least concern. So a really, really cool animal. Love these guys. I love these little porcupines. Really, really cool. Let's have a look at you. Look at you cuties. Really nice to see a porcupine, because I know Jen was working on a crested porcupine, or like an old world porcupine, but I don't know what's happening with that. It's probably in Leaf's backlog because Jen's not in the botting community anymore, but she gave all of her old projects to kind of Leaf to do, so that'll be very interesting to see what comes of that. So really, really awesome. So, second to last, moving on. So we've got here the Steller's sea lion, a very interesting animal. This is done by Leaf, Jen, and Monsoon. So let's have a look at the wonderful big male here. Now look at you. Big, beautiful guy. So look at that. So the Steller sea lion, also known as the northern sea lion, these guys are a large, very large species of sea lion. These guys are typically found in coastal marine habitats around the northeastern Pacific Ocean and found in the Pacific Northwest of North America. And they can be found Oregon, California, Washington, and up to Alaska. Those can be found in the Aleutian Islands and also like to Sea of Obscurus and stuff like that, and Honshu's northern coastline. So pretty much like the Bering, the northern Pacific, that can be found. So in terms of their size, these guys are the largest of the air seals. So among pinnipeds, the only pinnipeds that are bigger are the both species of elephant seals and the walrus. So these guys are quite interesting in terms of their size, of course. So adult animals will tend to be lighter in color. Oh, what have you done? Oh, don't know what happened there, but let's have a look at you. Look how huge you are. Love these guys. So they can often range much lighter as adults. They'll range from pale yellow to tawny in color and even reddish, as you can kind of see here. And the Steller sea lion pups, if we can find them, there should be some pups. There's a pup here. You can see they're almost completely black, but adults are much lighter in color, as you can see. Females and males actually grow rapidly until their 5th year, and then females will slow down in terms of their growth because they're much smaller than the males. So adult females will typically, while we're talking about the females, let's show the females. So typically adult females will be about 2.3 to 2.9 meters or 7 to 9 feet long, with length of about 2.5 meters on average, or about 8 feet, and weigh between 240 to 350 kilograms, or about 530 to 770 pounds, and being on average about 263 kilos, or 580 pounds. And males will keep growing and growing. Let's see if we can find the male again. Here he is. So males will keep growing and growing and growing until their secondary sex traits kind of appear in their 5th to 8th years of life. So they become fully grown at about 8 years old, or 5 to 8 years old. And males are slightly longer than females, so they'll be about 2.8 to 3.2 meters, so about 9 to 10 feet, but they average about 3 meters, or about 9.8 feet. But males have much wider chests and larger necks, and they'll often just be much bigger and bulkier. And in terms of their weight, these guys can get huge. So males could weigh between 450 and 1,120 kilograms. That's between 990 and 2,470 pounds. And on average, they weigh about 544 kilograms, or about 1,200 pounds, pretty much. So very, very huge. And you can see they have much broader chests, much bigger forehead, and a thick mane of coarse hair that you can see that kind of shows them apart. So as I mentioned, these guys have quite a big range that can be found from Honshu in Japan throughout the Gulf of Alaska, and they can be found as south as kind of central California. And they used to breed as far south as the Channel Islands, but they've not been observed there since the 1980s, which sucks. Though based on genetic analyses, these guys have traditionally been divided into eastern and western stocks between the middle of Gulf of Alaska, though there's recent evidence to suggest that there might be a third one, with the Russian ones and the Kuril Islands being the third Asian ones. So a little bit difference there, which is quite interesting. Though in the summer, their range will actually tend to kind of shift southwards. Therefore, they have no reproductive rookeries in Japan. And there are several consistent haul-out sites around Japan in the winter and summer, and vagrants have been known to be as far spotted in like the Yellow Sea on the Korean Peninsula as well. And the oldest fossil known is from Japan from the early Pliocene, which is the late early Pliocene, so it's quite interesting. In terms of their habitats and things like that, these guys tend to live in coastal waters and subarctic areas, and they because of the cooler temperatures of the area. And like most other eared seals, these guys are amphibious. They spend some of their time on water and land. Though typically, Steller sea lions spend their time in the water feeding, but all that time reproducing, raising their pups and molting and resting. And Steller sea lions will usually congregate on isolated islands because they have the ideal terrestrial habitat. And these isolated habitats are preferred because they can avoid predation, and they can also control their body temperatures a little better and have access to better access to offshore prey, which is quite cool. Though some haul-out sites, which are known as rookeries, are often places where they will breed. Though, however, they'll often use them for molting as well. It depends. Like some sites they'll just use for molting, but there are specific sites that they like to use called rookeries for breeding. And however, there's lots of factors that can influence the amount of time these guys will spend on land, such as biotic factors and abiotic factors. So it could be temperature, prey, predator avoidance, tides and weather and things like that. So it's quite interesting. In terms of their foraging, these guys are skilled and opportunistic marine predators, so they feed on a wide range of fish and cephalopods. So they'll feed on walleye pollux, mackerels, herring, capelins, flatfish, cods, and rockfish. They'll also eat salmon and cephalopods like various squids and octopus. And they often seem to prefer shoaling fish and forage into like intertidal and continental shelves as well. They'll also usually aggregate in groups of up to 12 individuals, and depending on prey abundance. And they'll also be known to follow fishing vessels and have been found as bycatch as well. They'll prey on the bycatch as well. And the composition of their diet actually varies a lot between where they live and the season. In addition, in primary marine environments, they'll actually sometimes feed on estuarines as well. They'll enter estuaries and feed on brackish water fish such as sturgeon. And very occasionally, they have been known to prey on harbour seals, northern fur seals, and sea otter pups, which is quite interesting. And in terms of predation, they're kind of top tier carnivores, but they often can be preyed upon by killer whales. And shark species could be potential predators, such as great white and sleeper sharks, have been known to potentially prey on juveniles. So, in terms of reproduction, mature male sea lions will often gather towards mid-spring on these kind of reproductive rookeries. So the larger and older males will define a territory within this rookery, and kind of like very similar to elephant seals, things like that. The male will kind of have a week or so later. Then the females will come along, and the males will have a territory, and all the females in that territory are going to be his, and that's where he has babies as well. They'll often have like aquatic, semi-aquatic, and terrestrial territories, with males with semi-aquatic territories having the most effects in defending them, because they can basically have a territory that's from the water as well, which is quite cool. Typically, females are pregnant, they'll give birth arriving on a rookery, and copulation will generally occur 1 to 2 weeks after giving birth. So they basically have their baby, and then they'll get impregnated by this new male. So it's quite interesting. A fertilized egg may actually enter embryonic diapause for up to 2 to 3 months. So basically, they pause incubation for a little bit. Typically, they'll give birth to one baby, but twins can happen. And after a week or so of nursing, we'll have a look at the cute little babies we'll talk about 2 weeks or so of nursing, the females will progressively take longer and more frequent turns as she leaves the rookery, and then eventually become longer and longer. And then the mum and pup will leave the rookery together. This maternal attendance pattern is quite common with other sea lions as well, which is quite interesting, or aired seals. There's also been studies that show that average male pups actually consume more milk than females, so that can maybe due to the sexual dimorphism. So bigger males will need more food to survive, of course. And reproductive males will fast throughout the reproductive season, and they'll often enter the water once from mid-May to August. And then with the structure of these reproductive rookeries begin to fall apart when animals leave the open sea and disperse, things like that. Typically, the age of weaning is quite highly variable. So pups will reign with their mothers potentially of up to 4 years. And incidents of mothers feeding daughters, which are simultaneously feeding their own newborns, have been documented, though that's quite rare. A study also showed that female attendance and time spent with the pup is shaped by the increased nutritional demands of the pup as well. And females will average about 21 hours ashore and 36 hours at sea. And as the pups age, females begin to more time at sea again. And as the pups mature, specifically after the 6th week past birth, the mother seal will times decline by 30%. There's no relationship between the pup's activity or physical exertion, things like that. And their suckling time is unrelated as well, which is quite interesting. In terms of locomotion, though, they're quite quick swimmers, and as fast as the smaller California sea lions, which is quite interesting. They are quite good swimmers. They've got quite good velocity. Let's see if we can find one here. That must be we'll have a look at the females. So this is a very nice looking female. Glide velocity has been seen to about 3.4 meters or 1.2 to 1.5 body lengths per second, which is quite interesting. And in terms of diving, they're quite able to dive for long periods of time. They often will exhibit things like bradycardia and peripheral vasoconstriction that allows them to maximize their oxygen stores and efficiently forage and diving. In addition to these adaptations, these guys have thick blubber that allows them to kind of keep cool in the depths. Trained Steller sea lions for the Vancouver Aquarium have been actually placed in the open ocean to study their kind of diving metabolism. And Steller sea lions dives are more energetically costly as they perform diving bouts. The anabolic or aerobic diving limit for Steller sea lions have been observed to be affected by their nutritional state and their feeding. But also in terms of very similar to other sea lion species, these guys are vocal. So males will have quite a range of vocalizations, in part due to their behaviors, such as growling, belches, hisses, things like that, to serve as warnings. Both males and females actually will also produce underwater sounds, very similar to their above water sounds, that are like barks and belches and clicks. The primarily function for these sounds is social behavior, so it can be to scare away mates and scare away males and things like that. Vocalization is also critical for mothers and pups, as the mothers must find their pups in quite a crowded beach, so they'll often call out and then be like, "Hey, mum, I'm here." And the mother and pup will both use deceptive calls to kind of tell each other apart, which is quite interesting. And the aerial vocalizations have been described as similar to the belts and bellows of sheep, which is quite interesting. And because of the sexual dimorphism they have, the hearing actually differs in sensitivity because of their size and hearing structure. Females are much more sensitive to sound than males, perhaps due to the higher frequency call of their pups. And the Steller sea lion hearing ranges actually suggest they are capable of hearing underwater calls of one of their main predators, the killer whales. So that's kind of how they avoid each other. So in terms of their interaction with humans, they've been hunted for their meat and other commodities by prehistoric human communities in their range. And aside from food and clothing, their skin was also used to cover kayaks and things like that. They're historically, they've often had very slight commercial value, but for example, in the 19th century, their whiskers were sold for a penny apiece and used by tobacco pipe cleaners. But Steller sea lions are sometimes also killed by Russian fishermen, or by fishermen, and they can be seen as competitors or threats to fish stocks. And killing sea lions is prohibited in Russia and the US, which is quite good. But however, in Japan, there's a fixed number that can be harvested annually to protect the fisheries, which is probably not a good thing. But in terms of what's happened to these guys, in recent years, these guys have also been known to enter the Columbia River estuary and feed on sturgeons and rainbow trout and things like that, some of which are actually listed under the US Endangered Species Act, which is quite interesting. And they can be found in the Columbia River nearly year-round, with the exception of early summer, and they can be found as far upstream as the Bonneville Dam. And they're not as abundant as the California sea lion. They still can be quite common, and they're often tasked with concerns with managing their numbers and the fish population. But these guys are protected by the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So managers will often use non-lethal ways to kind of get these guys to go away, such as like sounds and rubber bullets, things like that, try to scare them away. Additionally, because they're so big, it can very potentially really hurt a human. So interfering or touching these guys is forbidden, and there could be lots of fines. And I wouldn't want to do that anyway because they're bloody enormous, and you could very seriously hurt yourself. So you can find the male. Let's see, is that the male or no? It must be the male. So let's have a look at the male here. Very, very cool guys. But in terms of their conservation, we'll have a talk about these guys. While the Eastern and Asian stocks appeared stable, the population in the West, so pretty much the American one, declined quite a lot, especially around the Aleutian Islands. It's estimated to have fallen between 70-80% since the 1970. As a consequence, the Western stock was considered endangered and is listed under the Endangered Species Act. And there's been since an object of extensive study and scientific debate as well. One suspicion of why they declined was because of overfishing, such as pollock, Alaska pollock and herring and other fish. This stems largely from the junk food hypothesis, representing a shift in diet from fatty herring to capelin to eating things that are leaner, such as pollock and flounder, therefore limiting their abilities to consume and store fat. And other hypotheses also include like increased predation by orcas and sharks, also in direct efforts of prey species like shifts due to climate change, or either shooting by fishermen, things like that. There's lots of things that could be cause that decline. Another reason for decline may have been tied to nutritional stress. So the lack of prey actually corresponded with the decline of population, and females and specifically obtaining an insufficient amount of nutrients as a result of their failure to complete their pregnancies. So that could be why as well. But in October 2013, they have been taken off. The eastern Steller sea lion population was taken off the US Endangered Species Act because of a major population comeback. So a good conservation story, but they do face some issues as well. And they are considered near threatened or vulnerable. So there is some threats to them. They're still coming back, but still got to worry about these guys because often things like fishing and hunting can be a big issue for these guys. But yeah, really, really cool. Really loves the Steller sea lion. Really nice to see a species like this in the game. Definitely a big fan. So again, that was done by Leaf, Jen, and Monsoon. So next we got to move on a cool animal. This one was done by Leaf and Monsoon. Well, not Leaf and Jen, I mean. We have got here the mule deer. So a very famous animal that we get to talk about finally. So these guys, the mule deer, these guys are a deer that is found only in the western United States, and they get their name from their ears, which are large and look like those of a mule. And there are two subspecies of mule deer grouped in with the black-tailed deer. So there is a couple subspecies. There's the mule deer group, which includes like the California mule deer and things like that, and then the black-tailed deer group, which can be found in the Pacific Northwest, and the stick-tailed deer, which is found in British Columbia. So, yeah, different subspecies. It's very confusing. I'm not going to get too into it. But the most notable differences between white-tailed deers and mule deers is ear size, their tail color, and their antler configuration. In many cases, body size is also a key difference. The mule deers, you can see they've got a black tip to the tail, while the white tip has obviously white tip. And also, mule deer antlers are bifurcated, which means they fork as they grow, rather than branching out from a single main beam like whitetails. And each spring, the buck antlers will start to regrow almost immediately after the old ones have shed. And shedding will take place typically around mid-February and varies a lot on the locale. So in terms of the three species of Ochlorus deer, these guys are the largest on average. They typically reach a height of about 80 to 106 centimeters, or about 31 to 42 centimeters at the shoulder, with the nose to tail length about 1.2 to 2.1 meters, or about 3 to 7 feet or so. And for this, the tail may be about 11 to 23 centimeters, or 4 to 9 inches. And adult bucks typically weigh between 55 to 150 kilograms, or 121 to 331 pounds, but they average about 92 kilograms, although trophy specimens have been known to get about 210 specimens of around 60 pounds, with females being a little bit smaller. They typically weigh between 43 and 90 kilograms, or about 95 to 198 pounds, with an average about 68 kilograms, or 150 pounds. And also, unlike the mule deer, the white-tailed deer, these guys do not generally show marked size variation across its range, although there can be some fluctuations. There's an exception to this. This is the Sitka deer, which is actually markedly smaller than the other mule deer, which get about 54.5 kilograms, or 120 pounds, on average for males, and about 36 kilograms, or 79 pounds for females, which is quite interesting. In terms of seasonal behavior, these guys often will search for food and move around. Their breeding cycle is quite important to understand their behavior. The rut or mating season will begin in fall, and they'll go for estrus, and the doe goes into estrus for a few days, and the males will become more aggressive, and they'll compete for mates. So does may mate with more than one buck and go back to estrus a month later, and if they do not become pregnant. They typically have a gestation. We'll have a look at the babies as we talk about that. Look at these cute little babies. They'll typically go into gestation about 190 to 200 days, with fawns being born in the spring. The survival rate of fawns during labor is about 50%, and fawns will stay with their mothers during the summer, and they're weaned by the fall after about 60 to 75 days. Mule deer females will often usually give birth to 2 fawns, though if they're the first time having a fawn, they'll often have 1. Also, the buck's antlers will kind of fall off during the winter and then grow again in preparation for the next year. The annual cycle of annular growth is actually regulated by changes in the length of day. And the size of the mule deer groups actually follows a seasonal pattern. So groups are smallest during the fawning season, so June, July in Saskatchewan and Alberta. And they'll become larger in early gestation, so winter, so February to March in Saskatchewan and Alberta. Though besides humans, these guys, the 3 leading predators that will eat these guys include coyotes, wolves, and jaguars. Also, bobcats, lynxes, wolverines, black bears, and grizzly bears may prey upon adult deer, but they'll most often attack fawns or eat deers that have died naturally. Bears and smaller carnivores are typically opportunistic, and they will pose little threat to a healthy adult mule deer. And in terms of diet and foraging, there's been lots of studies looking into their diets, and these guys will eat about 800 species of plant that vary a lot due to where they are and elevations, things like that. And there have been some variations known. So in winter, they'll eat a lot of shrub and trees, and then in spring, they'll eat a lot more kind of grasses and things like that. So it varies a lot during the seasons. And their diets is very similar to white-tailed deers and where they coexist. And the mule deer are kind of intermediate feeders, so they're not pure browsers or grazers. though they will predominantly browse but also eat forbs and vegetation. It also depends on the time of year as well, which is quite interesting. They've been known to things like rice grass, bearberries, dogwoods, Douglas firs, things like that. And humans will sometimes engage in supplemental feeding in extreme winters to avoid mule deer starvation. And wildlife agencies actually will discourage these efforts because they can be harm to, like, it can basically spread diseases and make them rely on humans and cause overpopulations of mule deer and habitat degradation because they'll often overbrowse, things like that. Though supplementing may be appropriate in some conditions, it's often just, but please don't do it. Pretty much. So don't feed deers, don't feed wild animals. It's very bad for them sometimes. But mule deer can be variably gregarious, so a large portion of solitary individuals, so often they live by themselves, or groups of less than 5 deer. The reported mean size of a group is about 3 to 5, an adult group, and highest has been 7. Let's have a look at the male. Anyway, mule deers are ruminants, which means they employ nutrient acquisition very similar. They'll often ferment plant material before digesting it. So deer will consume high fiber, low starch diet, and they'll require less food than a high starch, low fiber diet. So they often ruminate. So it often increases when the deer will consume high fiber, low starch diet and things like that. So very other types of ruminants that kind of what ruminant means is basically you have like your foregut and hindgut. So your foregut animals will be things like cows and things like that, and hindguts like elephants and things like that. They believe these guys are much more like hindgut fermenters. In terms of migration, though, these guys will migrate from low elevation winter ranges to high elevation summer ranges. Though not all individuals of population migrate, some will just hang around. It just depends. They'll often migrate in the fall to avoid harsh winter conditions such as steep snow that cover up food. Also evidence they'll actually also migrate based on cognitive memory. It means they'll use the same paths year after year, even if the availability of resource changes. So kind of do it because they remember it. But in terms of risks, there are many risks that these guys are facing because of climate change and human disturbance. Climate change often impacts the seasonal growth patterns that can be a risk for migrating mule deer, thereby invalidating learned migration patterns or invalidating historic patterns as well. Also, human activities such as natural resource extraction, highways, fencing, and urban development have fragmented and really hurt populations. Things like natural gas extraction has been found to have effects on mule deer behavior, and they even cause them to avoid areas as they migrate. Highways, often they'll get hit by cars and things like that, and often can be a barrier. And as traffic increases, it often less likely to these guys will often go and find other migration routes. But in terms of management, people have been trying to manage them, such as putting migration corridors and corridors across highways, avoiding drilling in times of year and with heavy traffic as well, and urban development. These guys have been obviously trying to connect habitats more, which is quite interesting and quite important for these guys. So yeah, really, really awesome, and I love the mule deer. Really nice to get such a famous animal in Planet Zoo finally. Really, really awesome animal. Love that horns as well. Not the horns, antlers. Really, really cool. So mule deer was done by Leaf and Jen, another really awesome mod. So yeah, I think this is a great place to end the video. So really, really awesome. Before we go though, let's have a look at this albino deer. Really, really cool. You can get obviously variation, stuff like that, but often I don't see them because I just pick animals at random. But yeah, really, really cool. So great place to end the video. So I really, really, really hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe. Always remember to hit the little bell icon to get notified of loading anything. So yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe, and bye-bye.